Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back into the slow, slightly foggy corridors of human history. So if you haven't already, go ahead and settle in. Get comfortable, dim whatever light is still insisting on existing, and let your brain slip into that pleasant, drowsy place just between thinking and not thinking. We won't be doing anything dramatic tonight. No battles, no cinematic chase scenes, and absolutely no historical surprises that spike your adrenaline. Instead, we're exploring something, well, a little herbal, a little smoky, a little older than most people realize. We're talking about when humans started using weed and then, because human beings cannot do anything normally, we'll drift gently into all the strange little habits that ancient people attached to their relaxation rituals, and their not-so-relaxing rituals, and their "this really should have been obvious, but somehow they still messed it up" rituals. But we'll start simple, with something green, ancient, and surprisingly well documented. The earliest moments when humans decided that plants should not only be eaten or woven or worshipped, but also smoked, inhaled, or otherwise shoved into their faces for fun. Now, despite what modern dispensaries might tell you with cheerful chalkboard signs featuring cartoon leaves and strangely upbeat reggae music, weed is not a new invention. Not by a long shot. It's been around longer than most empires, longer than organized religion as we know it, longer than the concept of hygiene in Europe, which, considering how low that bar once was, really says a lot. The plant itself is hardy, stubborn, and extremely good at surviving things it probably shouldn't, which does make it a fairly accurate plant metaphor for humanity. Archaeologists, who are essentially history detectives with more dust and fewer car chases, have traced cannabis back tens of thousands of years, and the earliest people didn't domesticate it right away. They mostly stared at it, probably wondering if it could be eaten without immediate death, or woven into something, or maybe used to patch a hole in their tent. And eventually, they figured out that yes, it can be used for rope. And also yes, it can be eaten. And finally, yes, unsurprisingly, it can make you feel extremely relaxed, mildly philosophical, and somewhat convinced that sitting on the ground for 4 hours is actually a very productive use of time. One of the oldest confirmed uses of weed comes from ancient Asia, particularly Central Asia, where cannabis grew wild on the steppes. You know these people, the early nomadic groups who were constantly moving around, dealing with harsh weather, wolves, neighboring tribes, and the daily existential crisis of, what if we walked in the wrong direction for an entire year? These early groups likely discovered cannabis the way many great discoveries in history happen. Accidentally, possibly while trying to light something else on fire. The earliest direct evidence of people actually smoking the stuff comes from about 2,500 years ago, in the Pamir Mountains. Archaeologists discovered wooden braziers with burnt cannabis residue. Not the mild industrial hemp variety either. The strong stuff. Strong enough that researchers politely used phrases like high psychoactive content, which, if translated into modern internet language, would be something closer to "this would absolutely obliterate you." So yes, ancient people were not messing around. But the roots go even deeper. We know the plant was domesticated for fiber at least 10,000 years ago. And somewhere along the line, this is my favorite part, someone took a long look at their basket weaving materials, then at a fire, then back at the plant and thought, what if? And just like that, human history was forever altered by curiosity, boredom, and a willingness to inhale burning leaves. Let's drift gently toward one of the earliest civilizations to leave written records about cannabis, ancient China. So as we ease our way out of the swirling smoke-filled tents of ancient Central Asia, let's drift somewhere else, somewhere quieter, dimmer, and frankly, a little more confused about what plants are actually supposed to do. Somewhere where everything is damp for no reason, where people believed wearing a garlic necklace counted as medical innovation, and where the average life expectancy seemed personally offended by the concept of longevity. Let's drift into medieval Europe. And remember, we're not speeding there. We're floating. Softly, like a tiny herb leaf carried by a vaguely cooperative breeze. No rush. You're probably settling deeper into whatever blanket or pillow you've claimed for the evening, and honestly, that is the correct posture for medieval history, because the Middle Ages were slow and sleepy, and filled with people trying their best with only 3 scientific facts and a dream. By the time cannabis reached medieval Europeans, it had settled into a rather unglamorous role. It wasn't divine. It wasn't spiritual. It wasn't used for Scythian-style sauna parties. Europeans mostly looked at the hemp plant and went, well, we can make rope out of that. And then they did that, repeatedly, enthusiastically, almost aggressively at times. Hemp ropes held ships together. Hemp fibers became clothing. Hemp seeds were fed to livestock. Nearly every household had some form of hemp product, which meant medieval Europe was technically filled with weed. They just weren't using it in the way any modern viewer of this video might imagine. To be fair, medieval people had bigger concerns, like famine and plagues, and the fact that bathing was treated like a hobby rather than a hygiene practice. If you have only 2 sets of clothes for your entire life, and one of them is made from hemp, you're not exactly experimenting with recreational plant smoke in your free time. But there were healers, midwives, and herbalists who knew the plant's medicinal side. Quietly, discreetly, because medieval medical knowledge was heavily policed by men who often confused, "I don't understand this," with, "it must be sorcery." Herbalists used cannabis to soothe pain, calm inflammation, and help those suffering from stiff joints, which, in a world where people carried buckets of water for a living, was basically everyone over the age of 25. Hemp oil was used for poultices. Crushed cannabis seeds were added to brews, but the idea of lighting it on fire to relax? Very rare. Not because they were morally opposed, they just didn't think of it. Medieval Europe was impressively uncreative about some things. They had churches decorated with gold leaf and soaring spires, but when it came to herbs, they mostly said, "Maybe this helps with headaches? Let's rub it on something and hope for the best." Still, every now and then, a physician would write a note about it, usually in Latin, and always with a tone suggesting that they felt very clever for rediscovering something Asia had figured out thousands of years earlier. We'll drift gently past them and move toward one of my favorite historical transitions, the moment when Europeans finally started getting curious about things again. The Renaissance. When suddenly, after hundreds of years of quietly surviving, Europeans collectively looked around and said, "You know what? Maybe we should read some books. Maybe we should examine some plants. Maybe we should stop basing medical knowledge solely on whether Mars is in retrograde." This is when cannabis started getting attention again. Botanists, who were basically plant enthusiasts with fancy hats, began drawing the plant in their herbals. They described its uses, its properties, and in one case, its warming and moist nature, which sounds like they were reviewing a loaf of bread rather than a useful plant. And while Europe was rediscovering cannabis as medicine, the rest of the world continued its relationship with the plant in more interesting ways. In India, bhang remained a beloved companion at festivals, offered to deities and consumed by devotees who likely experienced the divine in ways that can only be described as pleasantly floaty. In parts of the Middle East, hashish quietly persisted despite occasional moral panics. And in Africa, various cultures adopted cannabis into their traditions, using it for both ritual and relaxation. Humans everywhere seemed to agree on one essential point. The plant was helpful, comforting, predictable even, which is more than can be said for many aspects of pre-modern life. Let's drift softly forward again, moving into the early modern period, when trade routes expanded, ships started crossing oceans with alarming regularity, and plants traveled the world with the enthusiasm of influencers seeking new photo spots. Cannabis followed sailors, colonists, traders, and explorers. Hemp became a major crop in places like colonial America, and here we get one of the funniest misconceptions in popular history. The idea that certain founding fathers were secretly getting high. Now, could they have? Possibly. Would they have? Unlikely. The hemp grown in early America was almost entirely industrial, tall, fibrous, and about as psychoactive as a beige cardigan. Still, imagining a casually stoned George Washington staring at his future presidential duties with mild concern is amusing, so I won't take that away from you. But let's drift somewhere else now. Not into politics, not into scientific discovery, but into something more human. The small, private, quiet ways people used cannabis historically, not in rituals, not in grand ceremonies, but at home, in villages, in personal lives that aren't recorded in grand chronicles. Think of the people in ancient India who drank bhang as part of everyday life, not for festivals, but simply because the day was long and life was tiring. Think of the people in medieval Asia who burned cannabis resin in braziers to help with sleep, something deeply relatable to anyone listening to this video right now. Think of the healers who used it to comfort the sick, the elderly, or the grieving. History often shows us kings and wars and grand constructions, but plants, humble and unassuming, quietly shaped the inner lives of ordinary people. And cannabis, in particular, was a companion, a softening agent for the sharp edges of life. Humans, across thousands of years, kept returning to this plant in different forms, through different cultures, for different reasons. Healing, ritual, curiosity, comfort, and sometimes, just to make the long evenings feel a little softer. And maybe that's the quiet truth of tonight's exploration. Cannabis isn't just a plant with a complicated legal history. It's one of humanity's oldest companions, shaping our rituals, easing our aches, filling our tents with fragrant smoke, soothing minds after long days, and occasionally causing someone to stare at a piece of pottery for 3 hours because it suddenly felt very profound. As we drift toward the end of this part, let your mind rest on a simple thought. If you lived centuries ago, medieval healer, ancient nomad, Victorian philosopher, how would you have used this plant? Would you have treated it as medicine, as ritual, or as something to help you sleep on long, uncomfortable nights when the world felt a little too heavy? Tell me in the comments if your eyes are still open. So, as we glide out of the Victorian era's pleasantly cluttered apothecary shelves and drift into the soft haze of the early 20th century, let's settle into a comfortable thought. Humanity, after thousands of years of using cannabis calmly, democratically, and mostly without fuss, suddenly decided it was time to panic. Not moderately, not cautiously, but dramatically, loudly, and with great enthusiasm, as if they had just realized the plant had been gossiping about them behind their backs. The early 1900s are where cannabis meets modernity, and modernity, as usual, handles things with a combination of confusion and overreaction. Imagine the world changing rapidly, cars rumbling noisily down streets, telephones ringing with an intensity that startled everyone, factories churning out smoke in quantities that would horrify a modern environmentalist. Amid this chaos, governments started looking around for things to regulate, and cannabis, a quiet wallflower of the botanical world, somehow found itself dragged into the spotlight. The United States, in particular, developed an unusual obsession with labeling plants as moral threats. This is a country that once worried about tomatoes because people thought they were poisonous. So, when cannabis began appearing in newspapers, its reputation was shaped less by evidence and more by, let's be gentle, creative storytelling. While the plant had been used in America for medicinal purposes through the 1800s, everything changed once sensationalist headlines became a popular way to sell papers. Suddenly, cannabis wasn't a humble herb. It was the madness weed, the devil's harvest, the destroyer of youth. Headlines were written by people who seemed deeply committed to imagining the worst possible scenarios, usually involving jazz musicians, rebellious teenagers, and general societal collapse. You'd almost think cannabis had, personally, insulted them. But we're not here for political ranting. We're drifting, softly, sleepily. The point is that, in the early 20th century, cannabis transformed from a respected medicinal ingredient into a misunderstood villain. And the panic spread to other countries that, for centuries, had used the plant without incident. It's a fascinating historical phenomenon when you consider that the Victorian household just one generation earlier had cannabis tincture casually resting next to cinnamon. While some parts of the world were busy demonizing the plant, others continued their traditions quietly. India maintained its long-standing relationship with bhang. Jamaica incorporated cannabis into cultural and spiritual practices. The Middle East continued its centuries-old familiarity with hashish. Africa saw communities blending cannabis into ritual healing and daily comfort. To many societies, nothing had changed. Humans still relied on the plant as they always had. But global attitudes were drifting toward stricter laws and heavier enforcement. You can almost imagine cannabis as a confused houseplant being scolded for existing. As we drift into this era, something interesting happens on the scientific front. Researchers began studying cannabis again. Not from curiosity, but because governments wanted to know whether the scary newspaper stories were true. Scientists, who prefer actual evidence over theatrics, quickly found that cannabis didn't make people violent, didn't cause insanity, and didn't transform mild-mannered citizens into marauding jazz rebels. What it did do was relax people, sometimes too much, which perhaps offended those who preferred their citizens anxious and overworked. Let's float somewhere gentler now, into the private lives of ordinary people in the early 1900s. While governments debated, while newspapers dramatized, a quiet truth remained. Cannabis was still used by everyday people who weren't looking for rebellion, crime, or chaos. They just wanted relief, something for pain, for insomnia, for anxiety, for the quiet, unspoken burdens life placed on them. And here, in these private moments, the quiet nighttime smoke, the shared laughter among friends, the patient sipping of tea laced with the plant, you see the continuity that stretches across millennia. Humans, no matter the era, use what the earth offers to soften the edges of existence. But let's drift onward again, into the mid-20th century, where cultural shifts became louder, stranger, and more contradictory. The 1960s, for example, saw cannabis burst back into popularity, not as medicine, not as ritual, but as a symbol of counterculture. A plant that had once accompanied nomads on the Asian steppes was now caught between rock music, protest movements, and the lingering anxiety of governments that still believed it had sinister motives. It's almost poetic, really. A humble leaf being treated as if it had revolutionary ambitions. But if we zoom out, soften the edges, and look at the broader timeline, what we see is something beautifully consistent. Cannabis has always been tied to transitions, between old worlds and new ones, between tradition and modernity, between personal comfort and social expectations. And through all of it, humans have remained wonderfully human. Curious, stubborn, easily panicked, frequently contradictory, but also resilient, adaptable, and perpetually searching for things, plants, rituals, stories, that make life gentler. Let's float a little deeper into the cultural side of things. Across the centuries, cannabis has influenced art, music, sea, and storytelling in subtle waves. Ancient shamans used it to enhance visions. Medieval poets mentioned its calming properties in hushed tones. Sufi mystics used hashish in their spiritual practices to approach states of contemplation that words could barely describe. In the Caribbean, cannabis intertwined with rhythms that carried across oceans. In America, it found its way into jazz clubs, then blues, then the early days of rock. And yet, through all of this, the plant remained the same, unchanged, a quiet constant. History, on the other hand, shifted wildly around it. Let's drift for a moment into the idea of plants becoming political symbols. It seems absurd when you think about it slowly. Humans have always assigned moral meaning to things that grow out of dirt. Tobacco was once praised as a gift from the heavens. Tea shaped global empires. Coffee fueled revolutions, and several philosophers. Opium caused wars. And cannabis. Well, cannabis got caught in the crossfire of cultural anxieties and moral philosophies that had very little to do with the plant itself. One of the quiet ironies of the 20th century is that the harshest anti-cannabis countries were often the same ones that once depended heavily on hemp for their economies. A plant that built ships, clothed populations, and treated medical ailments suddenly turned into a social threat. It's a historical whiplash moment, the kind that makes you blink twice and say, "Really? This is the hill you want to die on?" But drifting back to our soothing pace, let's move beyond conflict. Let's follow the plant not through laws and propaganda, but through the personal stories of people who used it to soften their days. Imagine someone in 1920s New Orleans, playing soft trumpet notes in a smoke-filled room, feeling the weight of the day dissolve into the music. Imagine a mother in colonial India preparing bhang during a festival, mixing milk and spices while the house fills with warm scents. Imagine a healer in ancient China grinding seeds with calm, practiced hands. Imagine a Scythian warrior sitting in a tent of fragrant air, laughing loudly because Herodotus absolutely did not exaggerate this part. These human moments are the true timeline, the emotional history of cannabis. Now, as we drift into the late 20th century, something interesting happens once again. Science circles back. Researchers start studying cannabinoids. Medical communities begin to acknowledge what ancient people already knew. Cannabis does relieve pain. It does help with anxiety. It does reduce nausea. It does ease insomnia. The same conclusions found in early Chinese texts, Egyptian mixtures, and Indian traditions slowly re-emerge, dressed in scientific terminology and clinical research. It's a full-circle moment, the kind that makes history feel less like a straight line and more like a gentle spiral. Let's soften our pace even more. Imagine the world today. With cannabis legalized in some places, decriminalized in others, still controversial in many, and forever tied to a long, complicated, strangely poetic human journey. A journey that stretches across continents, cultures, empires, and eras. From ancient braziers in Central Asia to modern dispensaries with creatively named strains, it is, and has always been, simply a plant. One that humans discovered, used, debated, misunderstood, and rediscovered again and again. And maybe that's the quiet lesson here. History is not just events. It's habits, rituals, accidents, curiosities, people trying things because life is hard and plants are available. So, before we drift out of this part, I'll leave you with a soft question for the comments, just to stretch your mind a little before it floats away entirely. If you lived in any era, Scythian, Victorian, 1960s, or modern, Which version of cannabis culture do you think you'd fit into? The ritual, the medicinal, the artistic, or the relaxing? Let me know if you're still awake. If you're still awake by this point, you're doing better than most listeners of sleepy history channels. Because tonight's chapter focuses on the luxury habits of ancient Rome, habits so slow-paced, so strangely ordinary, so gently odd, that even Roman citizens themselves probably drifted into boredom thinking about them. Rome, the great empire of marble, legions, and long speeches, was also an empire of, well, small comforts. Unnecessary comforts. And comforts that, when examined quietly at night, reveal more about the Roman soul than the big dramatic stories ever do. Tonight, we will explore those comforts, the forgotten luxuries, the subtle rituals, and the harmless extravagances of a civilization that mastered the art of enjoying time, even if it meant doing things that seem strange to us today. So settle in. The torches are dim. The wine amphora has been sealed. The Roman streets are nearly silent. Let us walk slowly into the soft world of Roman leisure. The Roman obsession with time wasting. The Romans are remembered for their efficiency, roads, aqueducts, and military formations, but privately, they adored wasting time in sophisticated ways. One of their favorites was the bathhouse routine, and calling it a routine is perhaps too small a word. For many Romans, the baths were a daily pilgrimage, not for health or cleanliness, but for pleasure, gossip, mild existential reflection, and sometimes just because the water was pleasantly warm. Bathhouses weren't simply a place to wash. They were a mixture of sauna, coffee shop, gym, barbershop, lounge, and social media feed, all rolled into one large, echoing hall of warm stone. You entered first into the apothecaries, where you left your clothes with an attendant. Most Romans spent far longer undressing than we might expect, adjusting their tunics, removing small pieces of jewelry, commenting on the weather, talking about nothing of value. Then there was the tepidarium, the warm room. This was the Roman version of lukewarm comfort. Nothing too hot, nothing too cold, just a balanced space for your body to relax and your mind to shut down. People spent hours here doing absolutely nothing, just lying on benches, half asleep, listening to the muffled echoes of water dripping somewhere in the distance. You might picture a large group of senators, athletes, merchants, and everyday laborers all sitting together, half awake, nodding slowly as if listening to a lecture they weren't required to stay awake for. For the Romans, that was luxury, to be in a room where nothing required your energy. After warming up, Romans had their bodies covered in oils, scented olive oil, usually, because soap wasn't widely used. A strigil, a kind of curved scraper, was then used to remove the oil and whatever dirt had mixed with it. The scraping wasn't harsh. It was slow, almost meditative. Some Romans enjoyed it so much they hired personal slaves whose only job was to apply oil and remove it. Imagine calling that your profession, full-time relaxation facilitator. There was no rush. The oiling could take as long as you wanted, long enough to forget you were supposed to go home for dinner. Another sign of Roman luxury was the hypocaust, the underfloor heating system. The idea behind it was simple. If the floor is warm, the world feels less threatening. The warmth came from hot air traveling under the stones, created by a furnace outside. It was quiet, subtle heat, the kind that slowly radiates upward and invites you to lie on your stomach, thinking about nothing. Only the wealthy had private hypocausts, but public buildings sometimes offered them too. There are written accounts of people lying on the floor of heated rooms, staring at the ceiling mosaics, counting tiny tiles as if they were sheep. Warmth, stillness, and tile counting. This was ancient Rome's version of a sleep aid. The ancient Roman love of silly pets. We imagine Romans with lions and exotic animals, and yes, some wealthy Romans collected strange creatures, But many also kept small, gentle, and incredibly boring pets. Snails, for example. Yes, snails. Some Romans raised luxury snails in stone enclosures called cochlearia. They fed them special diets to enlarge them, mostly for eating, but some people kept them because, in a very slow-moving way, snails were soothing to watch. Watching a snail go from one leaf to another could genuinely take long enough to be considered a leisure activity. Then there were dormice, tiny, fluffy creatures kept in pots called gliraria. They were coddled, fed carefully, and treated with a tenderness that seems surprising from people known for gladiator battles. Owning a plump dormouse was not just a status symbol. It was a lifestyle, a calm, quiet one, the most uneventful banquets in history. Roman banquets were grand, but they were not fast. They were long, slow, drawn-out affairs where people spent more time reclining on couches than eating. A typical banquet lasted several hours. Not because there was so much to eat, but because the Romans preferred to linger over every stage. The opening appetizers, the mild chatter, the long pause before the wine, the equally long pause before dessert, the even longer pause after dessert where nobody wanted to get up. The actual course of the meal wasn't important. The slowness was the luxury. You weren't supposed to be in a hurry. Time was a sort of soft cushion everyone rested on. Conversation topics at Roman banquets were not exciting. Writers from the period even joke about the boredom. Lengthy discussions of weather patterns, updates on someone's fig trees, minor temple restorations, who had recently purchased new sandals, arguments about slightly different types of olive oil. Imagine an entire empire concerned with olive oil varieties and arguing about them with passion. The Romans didn't mind long silences either. They considered silence a part of the social experience. A room full of wealthy Romans reclining in perfect stillness, listening to the crackling of lamps, sipping wine very slowly. It almost sounds like a relaxation exercise today. The Roman passion for minor collections. While some Romans collected marble statues or elaborate mosaics, many had hobbies so quiet they barely counted as activities at all. Collecting oddly shaped small stones, gathering seashells, keeping boxes of miniature pottery, arranging feathers, saving pretty glass fragments, cataloging lamps. One historian wrote that a wealthy Roman senator proudly showed guests his collection of 400 small bronze spoons. Not special spoons, not ceremonial spoons, just spoons that were slightly different from one another. This was considered a charming hobby, a peaceful one. You could imagine him sitting at his desk in the late afternoon, carefully polishing spoon number 267, humming softly, watching dust motes drift through the sunlight. Romans did not have sticky notes, but they had wax tablets. People used them constantly, not just for business or letters, but for tiny reminders and pleasant scribbles. Buy more figs. Send cloak for repair. Ask neighbor about lost chicken. Remember to nap. Yes, Romans actually wrote reminders to nap. Some people decorated their wax tablets, carving soft patterns into the wax, smoothing it again, then carving new ones. It was a quiet hobby, the kind of hobby that could occupy someone's entire afternoon without them noticing. Romans did not have sticky notes, but they had wax tablets. People used them constantly, not just for business or letters, but for tiny reminders and pleasant scribbles. Buy more figs. Send cloak for repair. Ask neighbor about lost chicken. Remember to nap. Yes, Romans actually wrote reminders to nap. Some people decorated their wax tablets, carving soft patterns into the wax, smoothing it again, then carving new ones. It was a quiet hobby, the kind of hobby that could occupy someone's entire afternoon without them noticing. If you've settled deeper into your pillow by now, you're right where medieval people would want you, because sleep in the Middle Ages was not just a necessity. It was a ritual, a pattern. A slow drift into the night shaped by candles, cold rooms, and habits that today feel entirely unfamiliar. This chapter is a gentle walk through those habits, the silent rhythm of medieval nights, and the small, almost drowsy traditions that guided people from dusk to dawn. Let's begin with the biggest surprise. They didn't sleep all night in one go. Most medieval people didn't sleep straight through the night like we expect to today. Instead, they practiced what historians call segmented sleep. 2 separate sleeps, divided by a peaceful hour or 2 in the middle of the night. The first sleep began soon after sunset. The second sleep came in the early morning hours. In between was the watch, a quiet, wakeful period. During that time, people didn't do anything urgent. They didn't rush. The darkness was soft, and the quiet was comforting. Some prayed, some stretched, some tended the fire a little. Some simply sat on the edge of their straw mattresses, listening to the wind outside. Others visited neighbors, which sounds surprising, but the medieval world was far more communal than ours. A quiet knock at night wasn't alarming. It was normal. This middle-of-the-night wakefulness was considered natural, even healthy. People expected it. If you wake up in the middle of the night today, a medieval person would simply nod and say, "Ah, you're between sleeps." Bedrooms were colder than you can imagine. Medieval homes didn't retain heat well. Stone walls held on to the day's cold, and windows, if they had windows at all, were drafty. So people slept in layers. Thick tunics, woolen socks, sometimes even hats designed only for nighttime warmth. Blankets were heavy, sometimes surprisingly heavy, stuffed with feathers or wool. And families often slept together, not necessarily for emotional closeness, but for warmth. You'd hear the soft breathing of others, the faint crackle of a low fire, the hoot of an owl outside. This quiet combination was the medieval version of a lullaby. Pillows were rare, and beds were firmer. In most homes, pillows were a luxury. Many slept on bolsters, long, cylinder-shaped cushions, or simply folded cloths. Beds were firm, very firm. Made of rope lattices or wooden planks with straw mattresses that needed regular fluffing. The constant creak and soft rustle of straw was part of nightly life. Not annoying, just expected. And for many, it was comforting. Sleeping positions had rules. Believe it or not, medieval writers gave actual advice on how to sleep. Start on your right side, switch to your left halfway through the night. Don't sleep on your back. It invites dark thoughts. Don't sleep on your stomach. It compresses the organs. This advice was more superstition than science, but people followed it. Even their sleeping posture was deliberate, slow, and almost ceremonial. Nighttime was when thoughts were softest. The medieval night had a special mood. No streetlights, no machines humming, no glowing screens, just candlelight and moonlight shifting gently across wooden beams. People often described nighttime as a moment when the world paused, when everything felt closer, when problems lost their sharp edges. During the waking period between first and second sleep, people often reflected on the day's small events, memories, hopes for better harvests, small personal worries, prayers whispered quietly into the dark. These weren't dramatic moments. They were soft ones. The kinds of thoughts you have when you're half asleep and comfortable. The gentle ritual of night candles. Candles were precious, so they weren't burned constantly. But many households kept one single candle lit during the first part of the night. It wasn't bright, just enough to see the outline of your room. As the candle shrank, the flame flickered slower, and the light dimmed. It felt like a countdown to sleep. You didn't rush. You didn't fight it. You let the darkness come to you. Many medieval people fell asleep watching the candle fade, as if the night itself were tucking them in. The quiet early hours of second sleep. After the wakeful hour or two came second sleep, a deeper, easier rest that carried people into dawn. Animals stirred outside. Roosters crowed early. Soft morning light filtered through shutters. People rose slowly, not with the sharp alarm we know today. They stretched, folded blankets, and stirred the ashes of the fire to bring back warmth. The day began not with noise, but with calm. The slow beauty of medieval sleep. When you step back and look at it, medieval sleep wasn't strange. It was peaceful. It followed the rhythm of nature. It flowed with darkness and dawn. It embraced waking as part of resting. It celebrated stillness. It respected the softness of night. And perhaps if you're listening now with heavy eyes and slow breathing, you're closer to that medieval rhythm than you think. As we drift out of the quiet, straw-filled bedrooms of medieval families and into the wider nighttime world, it's worth remembering that darkness meant something very different back then. Today, night is just night. Streetlights glow, screens shine, cars pass by. The world doesn't really stop. But for medieval people, the coming of night was like slipping into a different dimension. A softer one, a muddier one, a slightly unsettling one, and one where the boundary between the natural and supernatural felt thin enough to reach through. So, as you settle deeper under your blanket, let's drift gently through what medieval people actually did once the sun set. How they ate, worshipped, feared, gossiped, dreamt, wandered, and whispered their way through the nighttime hours. No hurry, no drama. Just a slow walk through shadows that once held entire worlds. The evening meal that wasn't really dinner, the medieval dinner, happened earlier in the day, closer to what we'd call lunch. So the evening meal was quieter, simpler, and often smaller. Bread, a little cheese, a leftover stew, sometimes ale, which was safer than water, sometimes nothing at all, especially for poorer families. People didn't eat heavy meals at night, partly because food was precious, but also because many believed that sleeping on a full stomach caused troubling dreams. And if medieval people were afraid of anything, besides famine, disease, taxes, landlords, and the occasional unpredictable rooster, it was troubling dreams. They took dreams seriously, very seriously. Entire books were written about dream meanings. Dream interpretation was practically a medieval hobby, right up there with worrying about everything. So people tended to keep evenings light. A soft meal, a small blessing, a gentle end to the day. The soft buzz of medieval taverns, while most households grew dark and quiet after sunset. Dainty, taverns lit up with low, flickering warmth. Not loud, not wild, just softly noisy. You'd hear murmuring voices, clinking cups, the creak of wooden benches, a lute that was only approximately in tune, occasional laughter, the sort that drifts rather than bursts. Taverns weren't just drinking places, they were the medieval version of social media, the village news feed, the place where you learned who got a new cow, who lost a cow, who was thinking of suing their neighbor for stealing a chicken, who found a mysterious shoe, and other highly relevant breaking news. But even taverns dimmed early, candles cost money, ale cost labor, and everyone had to be awake at dawn whether they liked it or not. So the nighttime hours that feel social to us were, for medieval people, mostly quiet. Modern dark is nothing. Medieval dark was a living thing. Imagine, no streetlights, no lamps outside, no glow from distant towns, no neon signs, no headlights, just the moon, the stars, and whatever your imagination decided to add to the shadows. People genuinely believed the night was dangerous, not metaphorically, literally. Wolves, thieves, stray pigs, which could be surprisingly aggressive, wandering drunks, Spirits, demons, ghosts, elves, fairies. Yes, medieval people believed in all of them, and they assumed these creatures were night shift employees. So people avoided going outside unless absolutely necessary. And if someone did go out at night, they often carried a torch, a lantern, or a large stick, just in case something supernatural needed gentle convincing to leave them alone. The medieval world was woven with invisible beliefs. Every forest had a guardian spirit. Every crossroads had a rumor. Every abandoned building had a ghost story attached to it, usually told by people who had never actually been inside. Night deepened these beliefs. Remember, no artificial light. Your own home looked eerily different at night. Furniture became threatening shapes. Walls creaked. Wind sighed through chinks. Animals made mysterious noises outside. This was prime supernatural territory. People believed witches flew at night, demons perched on sleeping chests, fairies lured travelers into forests, spirits visited those between first and second sleep. Nightmares were caused by demons sitting on you. This demon even had a name, the Mara, origin of the word nightmare. It's a lovely thought to fall asleep to, I know, but we'll keep things soft, calm, distant. The point is, medieval nights carried a quiet tension, a mix of beauty and fear. The kind you feel when you hear a strange sound and decide it was definitely the wind, because you have no energy to investigate. Night watchers who were only sort of reliable. Most towns had a night guard or watchman, someone who patrolled the streets with a lantern and a staff, calling out the hours in a voice that was half reassuring, half monotone. It might sound calming, but medieval record keepers were unusually honest, and many wrote that night watchers fell asleep, got drunk, wandered off, or forgot to patrol entirely. Their job was to prevent crime, fires, or supernatural incidents, but their ability to do so varied wildly. Still, hearing a watchman's distant call gave people comfort. Something like, "It's 9 o'clock. All is well." Though it was never said in a way that sounded entirely convincing, more like, "It's 9 o'clock. Probably fine. I think." The soft, private moments of medieval night. Let's drift inside again. Not into fear or superstition, but into those small, quiet things people did as night settled in. A mother brushing a child's hair before bed. A father mending a shoe with candlelight stretching his shadow. A grandmother whispering old folk tales that were half warning, half comfort. A teen practicing writing their name, slowly, carefully. A monk copying a manuscript with soft, steady strokes. A lonely shepherd dozing by the fire while listening to sheep breathing in the dark. A young couple whispering to each other, trying not to wake anyone else in the one-room house. These were the unrecorded moments, never written down, never chronicled, never turned into epic tales. But they were the real medieval nights. Quiet, ordinary. Human. So much of history is loud. Wars, kings, catastrophes. But most of life is made from evenings like these. Dreams. A serious, nighttime business. Medieval people treated dreams like messages. Some from God, some from angels, some from demons, some from last night's questionable stew. Dream interpretation books were incredibly popular. They explained in great confidence, if you dream of losing teeth, someone will die. If you dream of water, expect trouble. If you dream of birds, good news is coming. If you dream of pigs, prepare for bad weather. If you dream of fish, someone is watching you. If you dream of shoes, you will travel soon. Dream manuals were basically medieval Google, but slower, less accurate, and somehow still comforting. And people woke after their first sleep and talked about their dreams, analyzing them softly in candlelight. deciding which part was meaningful and which part was probably just digestion. Dreams made the night feel mystical, even for people who rarely thought about such things during the day. The night as a soft place of secrets. Night was when private conversations happened. Confessions, plans, arguments whispered under blankets. Apologies, promises, songs sung quietly so neighbors wouldn't hear. Lovers meeting in barns, which sounds romantic until you remember medieval barns smelled like medieval barns. Night wrapped people in darkness and allowed their softer thoughts to surface, thoughts that felt too fragile for daylight. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was gentle, soft, slow. Exactly the pace we're drifting in now, and then the first light of dawn. Before the rooster even thought about crowing, something happened in medieval homes. A faint shift in the air. As we drift out of the ordinary homes of medieval villagers and into the quiet stone corridors of monasteries, the nighttime world shifts again. Not louder, not brighter, just different. Structured, measured, guided by bells instead of instincts, by ritual instead of routine. While most people slept in their straw beds and wooden frames, monks followed a completely different relationship with the night, one that was equal parts spiritual devotion, discipline, and, frankly, sleep deprivation disguised as holiness. So tuck in a little deeper, breathe slowly, and let's wander softly into the monasteries, cathedrals, cloisters, and lonely hermit cells where the medieval night was not something to fear or even to rest through, but something to dedicate, hour by whispering hour. The night was a sacred shift for monks. While a typical medieval villager might be asleep by 8 or 9 p.m., monks kept a schedule that looked more like a modern night shift job, and then a morning shift, and then a day shift, all at the same time. It wasn't unusual for monastic sleep to be broken into multiple pieces. A short nap in the evening, waking for midnight prayers, a little more sleep if they were lucky, morning prayers before dawn, work and worship throughout the day. If this sounds exhausting, it was. Spectacularly exhausting. But monks believed that God was more present at night, when the world was quiet. Prayers carried more clearly. Meditation was deeper. Temptation was weaker. And the stillness felt like a sacred presence rather than an empty space. The night was not something to survive, but something to use. The soft echo of the midnight office. Imagine this. The monastery is silent. Cold stone walls breathe faint drafts. The only sound is the distant sigh of wind through cloister arches. Then, a bell. Deep, low, slow. Pulling monks from sleep like a gentle hand on the shoulder, this bell signaled matins, the midnight prayer service. Some monasteries held it at midnight sharp, others closer to 2 a.m., but all held it in darkness. Monks rose from their narrow wooden beds, some barely more than planks, and wrapped themselves in warm cloaks against the chill. They walked softly down corridors, carrying small lanterns, their footsteps echoing just enough to remind you that you're not alone. And then, in the church, chanting. Low, steady, hypnotic chanting. If you've ever heard Gregorian chant, you know the sound. It's not thrilling. It's not emotional. It's not dramatic. It's a kind of vocal breathing, calm, slow, repetitive enough to lull anyone into a meditative haze. These midnight chants were considered some of the most sacred moments of a monk's life. Not because they were lively, but because they required surrender, of comfort, of sleep, of personal preference. The night wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to devotion. The strange calm of stone and candle nights, medieval churches were not bright places even during the day. At night, they became almost dreamlike. The architecture was intentional. Echoing ceilings, tall arches, heavy columns. The darkness filled the space in a soft, velvety way. Candles flickered along the walls, lighting stone saints who stared down with expressions that ranged from serene to vaguely disappointed. Sometimes, a single candle flame might reflect across a polished chalice. Sometimes, incense smoke drifted in slow curls through beams of moonlight. Sometimes, the shadows trembled when monks moved past them. It was peaceful, solemn, designed to make the mind slow down, breathe deeply, and let go. You could almost fall asleep sitting upright, which monks absolutely did. Historical accounts are refreshingly honest. Monks nodded off during prayers, occasionally snored, and sometimes fell asleep so completely that their chanting faded into soft mumbling. Monastic rules started including reminders like, "Do not fall asleep during the office," as if monks needed the gentle reminder that God preferred them awake. After the midnight prayers, a small human intermission. After matins, monks sometimes returned to bed for a short second sleep. Other times they stayed awake, reading scripture by candlelight or performing simple tasks in silence. But one of the strangest and most charming things monks did? They talked, quietly, softly, sleepily. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't storytelling, just small things that slipped out when the world was quiet. Reflections about the Psalms, little observations, shared burdens, even simple comments about the cold. These were moments outside the strict rule, unwritten but deeply human. Like the peaceful conversations you have with someone you trust during a long night. This gentle nighttime companionship helped monks stay grounded, proof that even in the strictest spiritual life, humans always find a way to be comfortingly human. Hermit nights, a different kind of silence. Far away from monasteries, hermits lived a separate nighttime world. Some lived in caves, some in tiny huts in forests, some near rivers, some in abandoned chapels or small stone cells built just for solitude. Their nights were quieter than quiet. No chanting, no bells, no footsteps in cold corridors. Just wind against stone, owls calling, frogs near streams, the crackle of a small fire, and their own breath. Hermits embraced total silence, believing that in the stillness of night they could hear God more clearly. There's something deeply peaceful imagining a hermit sitting cross-legged in the darkness, watching embers fade, waiting for dawn without needing anything from the world. But hermits also recorded fears, voices in the dark, strange noises, the feeling of unseen presence, the weight of isolation. Night tested them, and surviving it felt like spiritual Roth nuns, night prayers, quiet, orderly, and a little more practical. While monks often struggled with staying awake, nuns tended to approach night prayers with a slightly more organized, maternal energy. Their prayer halls were smaller, warmer, less echoing. Their routines were gentler, and they were more willing to adjust schedules when sisters fell ill, grew elderly, or simply needed a little more rest. Some convents even allowed the older nuns to pray from their beds if they were too frail to walk the halls at night. There's something tender about that. A candle placed on a bedside table, a whispered psalm, a slow return to dreams. The night in a convent often felt like a blanket shared by dozens of sisters who understood the rhythm of each other's breathing. Night as the time of the holy fools. Not everyone who wandered at night was a monk, nun, or hermit. Some were mystics. Some were wandering prophets. Some were holy fools, people who renounced all possessions and wandered the world as spiritual teachers. They walked barefoot through villages at night, speaking softly to those still awake, comforting the lonely, praying at shrines, sometimes startling a sleeping dog and whispering apologies. Their presence was unsettling and calming at the same time, like meeting someone who lives partly in this world and partly in another. Night, for them, was a companion, a cloak, a quiet friend. Not everyone who wandered at night was a monk, nun, or hermit. Some were mystics, some were wandering prophets, some were holy fools, people who renounced all possessions and wandered the world as spiritual teachers. They walked barefoot through villages at night, speaking softly to those still awake, comforting the lonely, praying at shrines, sometimes startling a sleeping dog and whispering apologies. Their presence was unsettling and calming at the same time, like meeting someone who lives partly in this world and partly in another. Night, for them, was a companion, a cloak, a quiet friend. The hospices that never closed their doors, another nighttime presence in the medieval world, were the hospices, early hospitals and shelters for travelers. These places glowed with low firelight long after other buildings grew cold. Inside, monks or nuns tended to the sick, changed linens, stirred broth, and kept watch. There were no machines, no bright lamps, no bustling hallways. Just a large shared room filled with patients on narrow beds, whispering prayers or drifting in and out of fevered sleep. The night shift at a medieval hospice was gentle work, a wet cloth on a forehead, the soft sound of someone breathing more easily, a nurse humming a psalm under her breath, the slow walk between beds, checking for signs of pain. If you imagine falling asleep there, it wouldn't be to silence, but to murmurs, soft footsteps, fire crackling, the delicate sounds of people caring for one another. The lonely work of night millers' bakers. Some professions required night hours simply out of practicality. Millers often ground grain at night to avoid daytime heat, and the rhythmic turning of water wheels filled the dark with a steady, hypnotic rumble. Bakers began work around midnight so the morning bread would be ready by dawn. Their workshops were warm, glowing, and filled with the comforting scent of rising dough, probably one of the coziest places in the medieval world. While nearly everyone else slept, these workers kneaded, stirred, shaped, and baked in peaceful solitude. The night belonged to them, in a way others never got to experience. Dawn again. The night complete. By the time the first faint blue light rose over fields and rooftops, the medieval night had done its work. Monks completed their prayers. Bakers opened their doors. Families stirred from second sleep. Watchmen yawned their way home. Lanterns were extinguished. The world became practical again. Night wasn't just a pause between days. It was an entire realm, a structured one in monasteries, a mystical one for hermits, a gentle one for workers, a fearful one for villagers, and a sacred one for the devoted. And yet, through all those variations, one truth remained constant. The medieval night was slow, still, whispering, and deeply human. The kind of night that invites reflection. The kind of night you drift through rather than endure. The kind of night that matches the pace of this very moment. Let's drift onward again, floating gently from one century to another, as though time is nothing more than a thin curtain we brush aside with a yawn. We've wandered across ancient rituals, medieval panic, colonial mishaps, and the occasional royal meltdown that smelled faintly of damp tapestries. And now, as we settle into Part 8, it might be comforting to let your shoulders drop a bit, breathe out slowly, and imagine yourself drifting across a calm sea where the waves look suspiciously like the folds of an old map. Tonight, the coastline ahead belongs to a world that had just begun to realize it was getting connected. Not in an emotional sense, of course. Humans still struggled with that. But through trade, travel, and a very uneven understanding of geography. It was a world where plants and substances roamed more freely than people did, which is rather poetic when you think about it. You see, by the early modern period, roughly the 1500s to 1700s, people had developed the charming habit of sailing into territories they'd never heard of and declaring them discovered, despite the inconvenient fact that millions of people already lived there. And naturally, these accidental world tourists collected souvenirs: spices, tobacco, coffee, cacao, and occasionally a few plants they couldn't identify but insisted on carrying around anyway. Humans loved a novelty, especially if it could be chewed, smoked, boiled, or accidentally overdosed on during a poorly documented medical experiment. In this wandering age, cannabis spread with surprising enthusiasm. It traveled from port to port, hitched rides in merchant ships, and occasionally sprouted in places where no one could recall planting it. Hemp grew easily, after all, and if there is one thing history teaches us, it's that people love anything that grows with minimal effort. It's why weeds thrive and why basil plants in medieval kitchens did not. Even then, people misjudged their watering habits. Europe experienced something like a soft botanical awakening. Hemp became one of the continent's most valuable plants. Not for smoking, mind you, but for making rope, sails, and textiles. It was strong, durable, and didn't complain about harsh working conditions, which made it quite popular among monarchs who were used to subjects complaining constantly. But recreational cannabis? That was still something of a mystery to most Europeans. They preferred alcohol, which was reliable, easy to produce, and required so few brain cells to enjoy that even the nobility could figure it out. Still, reports of cannabis use trickled in from travelers returning from the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and India. They described hashish dens with an air of theatrical dread, warning that the people inside looked suspiciously relaxed. This terrified European observers, who preferred their intoxications loud, chaotic, and capable of causing diplomatic incidents. The idea of lying quietly on a mat was far too foreign. And yet, despite the whispers, cannabis quietly threaded itself into European life in little ways. Apothecaries experimented with it. Physicians argued about it. Sailors smoked almost anything handed to them, often without asking what it was. The plant was there, lingering in the background like a character who isn't important yet, but keeps appearing in group scenes. As you drift through these centuries, you may notice a pattern emerging. People everywhere liked to unwind. They just had very different ideas about how. In some cultures, cannabis was an ancient friend. In others, an unfamiliar traveler. But steadily, quietly, it was becoming global. Now let's wander toward India, where cannabis had been part of religious, social, and everyday life for centuries. Devotees offered bhang, cannabis mixed with milk, spices, and occasionally far too much enthusiasm, to Shiva. Festival-goers drank it in celebration. Physicians used it for fevers, digestion, anxiety, and the general condition known as being alive. And travelers arriving from Europe always wrote about it as though they had stumbled upon some great secret, despite the fact that Indians talked about it openly and cheerfully. You almost have to admire the confidence of the European diarists, insisting they had discovered things that locals had been practicing for a millennium. If only those diaries came with an eye-roll emoji. Cannabis use in India flowed along without much controversy. It was simply part of life. People used it for rituals, celebrations, and healing. The British, however, arrived in the 18th century and became deeply confused by the whole situation. The British Empire disliked anything it didn't understand, which unfortunately included most things. So officials began arguing among themselves. Was cannabis a medical herb, a dangerous intoxicant, a plant that had the audacity to grow without permission? This confusion eventually led to the famous Indian Hemp Drugs Commission report of 1894. If you ever need something profoundly boring to fall asleep to, it's a perfect choice. The commission investigated cannabis use throughout India and concluded that, essentially, it wasn't really a problem at all. A rare case where a government study came to a neutral reason. Honorable conclusion. The British seemed disappointed. They preferred moral panics. Let's wander now toward the Americas, where cannabis arrived through trade, colonization, and the occasional ship captain who didn't label his cargo properly. Hemp was introduced in the 1600s and quickly became a major crop. Colonists used it for rope, cloth, and paper. George Washington grew it. Thomas Jefferson encouraged its cultivation. There is no evidence they smoked it recreationally, although many internet myths claim otherwise. Washington did write about separating the male from the female plants, which is often interpreted as a sly reference to potency. In truth, he was just trying to improve seed production. Still, the fact that he took gardening notes that detailed might be the most relatable thing about him. Recreational cannabis use in the early Americas was rare. Alcohol dominated social life, and tobacco was practically worshipped. But cannabis lingered quietly, waiting for its moment. That moment would come later, far later. But in the colonial era, the plant's best work was in making cloth. Not exactly thrilling, but very productive. By the 19th century, cannabis was making itself known again, this time in medicine. Apothecaries sold cannabis tinctures for pain, sleeplessness, migraines, restless nerves, digestive issues, and the existential dread that came from living in an era where medical tools resembled torture devices. Doctors liked cannabis because it was less risky than opium, though patients occasionally took too much and wrote letters describing a sensation of being pleasantly melted. Honestly, that sounds better than most 19th century experiences. Writers, too, experimented with cannabis. The Hashish Club in Paris became famous for its gatherings of artists, poets, and thinkers who consumed hashish and then attempted to describe their visions, usually in ways that made readers think the writers needed hobbies or more sunlight. Still, they were convinced they were doing something profound. They weren't, but they had fun, and no one tried to conquer a neighboring country because of it, which counts as a win. As we drift gently into the late 1800s, the world was moving faster than ever. Railways shrieked across landscapes. Factories churned and belched and demanded workers who were always tired. Empires grew, shrank, collided, and sulked. And through it all, cannabis remained a small but constant presence, sometimes celebrated, sometimes questioned, often misunderstood. The stage was being quietly set for the next century, when opinions about the plant would tilt sharply. But that's a heavy story for later. For now, imagine the world in a soft twilight, the calm before the storm of the 20th century. Ships roll gently across harbors. Apothecaries close their shutters for the night. Farmers gather bundles of hemp stalks and stack them neatly under fading light. Writers scratch the last lines of their journals before blowing out their lamps. It is a peaceful scene, in its own uneven, historically complicated way. And as you rest with this image, maybe ask yourself, if you lived in that era, wandering through markets scented with spices, smoke, ink, and hemp fiber, what would you have thought of this quiet, unassuming plant that traveled the world without needing a passport? Would you have recognized its future? Or would it have seemed like just another part of the landscape, useful, humble, and patiently waiting for humanity to understand it? Tell me in the comments if you're still awake. Let's drift forward again, as though we're floating downstream on a very patient river, the kind that doesn't rush anywhere, doesn't carve dramatic cliffs, and certainly doesn't have the energy to form waterfalls. Just a slow, steady glide into the next era. And as we let ourselves move along, the world around us shifts from the dim lantern-lit quiet of the late 19th century into the peculiar glow of the early 20th century, which was bright in a way that made people squint. Everything seemed louder: machines, ideas, politics, moral opinions. Humanity had invented noise and was determined to use it. The early 1900s were a complicated moment for cannabis. For thousands of years it had wandered peacefully through civilizations, rarely causing trouble, often being helpful, occasionally being misunderstood. But the 20th century was not a gentle century. It liked categories, orders, laws, and long lists of things it disapproved of. And naturally, this was when cannabis went from a somewhat quirky plant to a symbol of everything someone didn't like. The details changed depending on the country, but the theme was universal. People projected their fears onto plants because plants couldn't argue back. As we float into the first decades of the century, imagine pharmacies with polished wooden counters and glass jars full of tinctures, powders, and concoctions whose labels ranged from informative to wildly optimistic. Cannabis tinctures were still there, sitting quietly between bottles of opium-based cough syrup and tonics that claimed to fix everything short of heartbreak. Doctors prescribed cannabis for insomnia, headaches, and nervous conditions, which basically meant life. But the winds were shifting, and not in a romantic way. Governments had begun to notice that people enjoyed altering their mental state, and naturally governments decided this was unacceptable unless taxes were involved. Around this time, the United States began its long, theatrical struggle with the plant. Not because cannabis was causing widespread chaos, it wasn't, but because officials were looking for something to regulate after Prohibition began. Having banned alcohol, they found themselves with extra moral energy and nowhere to put it. So they rounded up substances at random, like a disorganized teacher confiscating items from a classroom. Cannabis ended up in the pile. What followed was a mixture of racism, propaganda, and bureaucratic confusion. Newspapers began printing exaggerated stories claiming cannabis caused violence, insanity, or the urgent desire to play jazz music. Three things that frightened certain Americans for overlapping but not particularly rational reasons. Most of the articles were written by people who had never seen cannabis, never met anyone who used it, and wouldn't know the difference between hemp and a decorative fern. And so, in 1937, the United States passed the Marijuana Tax Act. Not a ban, technically, just a tax so complicated it might as well have been a ban. This is a classic American strategy. If you don't like something, bury it in paperwork until no one can find it again. Overnight, cannabis went from a legitimate medicinal ingredient to something suspicious. People didn't stop using it, of course. They just felt guilty while doing so, which has always been an important part of American culture. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, cannabis continued along its usual route. In India, people still drank bhang during festivals. In the Middle East, hashish use drifted on, quietly and without official panic. In the Caribbean, cannabis blended into local culture, music, and community rituals. But globally, the tone was shifting. Colonizers, diplomats, and moral reformers began exporting their anxieties. Some nations banned cannabis to impress Western governments. Others banned it because they assumed something must be wrong with any plant that made people relax. And so, as the century progressed, cannabis found itself swept into a global wave of prohibition, not because it had changed, but because the world had. Humanity loves a good scapegoat. It's easier than admitting that societal problems require effort, planning, and listening, all of which are famously unpleasant. Still, people everywhere continued to use the plant, quietly, discreetly, with varying degrees of subtlety. Recreational cannabis began appearing in American jazz clubs, Mexican border towns, and Caribbean migrant communities. And wherever it appeared, the press followed, always eager to create a new panic. It's almost impressive how journalism could be both completely uninformed and extremely confident at the same time. But while some drug panics were loud and theatrical, cannabis use itself remained calm, much too calm for lawmakers' taste, in fact. People who drank too much caused property damage. People who smoked cannabis mostly sat down and forgot what they were arguing about. You can see how this was viewed as a problem by governments who needed lively, chaotic citizens to justify new laws. Let's drift gently now into the 1950s and 60s, an era shaped by rapid change, anxiety, and a deep cultural desire to appear wholesome while doing things that were absolutely not wholesome. Cannabis use spread quietly among young people, artists, musicians, and students who disliked the idea of becoming mid-century suburban adults. They smoked to think differently, to protest conformity, or simply because they enjoyed it. The authorities responded exactly as you'd expect, with more laws, more speeches, and more warnings that cannabis would destroy civilization. By the late 1960s, the plant had officially become a symbol, not of danger, but of rebellion, which is arguably worse from a government's perspective. Cannabis tied itself to the counterculture, which was already upsetting politicians by having opinions, growing their hair out, and questioning the wisdom of wars. The plant wasn't causing social upheaval, of course. People were. But symbolism is powerful, and cannabis became a convenient visual shorthand for everything traditional society didn't like. Enter the 1970s. The decade of disco, confusion, and questionable interior design. Cannabis use soared. Laws became contradictory. Public attitudes softened. Music festivals turned into clouds of smoke. And eventually, the U.S. government declared a war on drugs, which began less as a health initiative and more as a political strategy. Cannabis was swept into the same category as far more dangerous substances, not because of evidence, but because nuance had taken the decade off. This period was difficult for many communities. Enforcement was unequal, biased, and often severe. Young people across the world found themselves caught between cultural acceptance and legal risk. It was a strange, uneven time, one of those historical eras where you wish someone had paused to take a deep breath. Yet through all of this, the plant itself remained unchanged. It grew, quietly, shrugging off human drama. It had endured empires, plagues, ocean crossings, and silk roads. It had been a medicine, a fiber, a ritual tool, a scapegoat, and now a political talking point. And it waited, patiently, for humans to circle back to reason. As we drift into the 1980s and 90s, attitudes began to shift again. Medical cannabis re-entered public conversation. Doctors and patients spoke about pain relief, nausea treatment, and chronic illness management. For the first time in decades, governments listened, slowly, but more than before. Scientific studies emerged. Researchers rediscovered what ancient civilizations already knew. The plant had real medical value. It was almost funny, in a very tired way. Human ID had taken a millennium-long detour only to end up where it started. Culturally, cannabis settled into an odd position. It was illegal in many places, tolerated in others, and quietly decriminalized in a few. People debated it endlessly, often without understanding it. Another timeless human tradition. And yet, gradually, the tone softened. The moral panic faded. The world began to grasp that cannabis was not the source of its problems. If anything, it had been one of the quieter substances throughout history. As our narrative drifts toward the edge of the millennium, imagine the world preparing for the new century. Neon signs flickering, computer screens humming, governments drafting laws that would soon become outdated, and people everywhere carrying questions about the future. Cannabis was on the threshold of a new era, one where it would be reconsidered, re-evaluated, and slowly, cautiously, welcomed back into the mainstream. But for now, let's pause at this point in history, right on the gentle slope of the late 20th century, before things become more modern, more complex, and more thoroughly documented. Let's rest in the soft hum of change, the calm before the next wave. And as you settle here, Maybe ask yourself, if you had lived in that time, caught between old fears and new possibilities, what would your opinion have been? Would you have followed the panic? Or would you have looked at this ancient plant and wondered why people were arguing so much about something that, for centuries, had simply existed? Tell me in the comments if you're drifting awake enough to type. Still, the conversation continued. Slowly, softly, like a tide pulling in, not with crashing waves, but with gentle persistence. By the early 20th century, a remarkable thing happened. Cannabis, which humans had used for thousands of years without much fuss, suddenly became the villain of every story. Newspapers printed wild exaggerations. Politicians made dramatic speeches. People who had never seen the plant were convinced it turned individuals into dangerous lunatics. Which, historically speaking, was ironic, since many of those politicians had lifestyles far more unhinged than any cannabis user. But irony is one of humanity's greatest talents, so of course it had to show up here, too. As the decades drifted onward, research became contradictory. Laws became stricter. Whole generations grew up hearing terrifying cautionary tales without ever being told what the plant actually was. The world went from, "This hemp rope is useful," to "This herb will destroy civilization" in record time. Meanwhile, other countries quietly continued using cannabis the same way they always had, medically, spiritually, or casually, and wondered why the Western world appeared so troubled by a plant. But confusion is one of humanity's favorite pastimes. Some cultures embraced cannabis for centuries without drama. Others treated it like a mythical beast requiring endless regulation. There was no consistency at all, which, if you've listened to any of the previous parts, should feel comfortingly familiar by now. Let's drift a little closer to the present. By the late 20th century, scientists began studying cannabis seriously again. They found out that, shockingly, centuries of people using it medicinally weren't entirely mistaken. This discovery surprised no one except the handful of officials who had built entire careers around insisting the plant was pure chaos in leaf form. Governments went through incredibly slow cycles of accepting new information. Some changed their laws, some didn't. Some changed them and then changed them back because a committee got confused. If you've ever wondered how anything gets done, the answer is slowly, and usually after several meetings that could have been emails. Even today, cannabis occupies a strange place in global culture. In some countries, it's a medical treatment. In others, it's legal for fun. In a few, it's still treated like forbidden magic. And everywhere in between, societies are still trying to figure out how to regulate a plant that grows quite happily without permission. It's impressive, really. Humans have invented nuclear power, space travel, and artificial intelligence, yet still can't collectively decide whether cannabis is a healing herb, a harmless pastime, or the reason the youth refuse to mow their lawns. But perhaps that's the perfect ending to our sleepy survey of humanity's relationship with relaxation. People have been using cannabis for thousands of years to treat pain, to meditate, to celebrate, to get through long winters, or simply because it made their extremely stressful historical lives slightly more tolerable. And through all those centuries, one theme has stayed consistent. Humans never stop overcomplicating things. Still, the conversation continued, slowly, softly, like a tide pulling in, not with crashing waves, but with gentle persistence. Let's drift into the cultural landscape of the early 2000s, which was shaped by music, internet forums, early meme culture, and movies featuring characters who were far too enthusiastic about snacks. Cannabis had become a pop culture symbol again, though this time with a slightly comedic flavor. Not rebellious, not scandalous, just mildly chaotic in the harmless, silly way that made people say, "Ah, yes, they're having a good time." But behind the jokes and the movies and the confused early memes, a quieter reality was forming. People from older generations, grandparents, teachers, retirees, began using cannabis medically. They didn't see it as a cultural symbol. They saw it as relief. It helped with arthritis, nausea, insomnia, and stress. And slowly, the plant shed some of the stigma that had stuck to it like an overly affectionate piece of lint. As more people used it, more stories emerged. Stories of comfort, healing, and manageable lives. Stories of people who finally slept through the night. Stories of patients finding relief where pharmaceuticals had failed. These weren't dramatic or cinematic moments. They were soft, everyday improvements that built momentum over time. And in history, small changes often lead to bigger ones. By the 2010s, legalization began to spread with more confidence. Countries discussed it. States voted on it. Communities debated it around kitchen tables. Economists produced reports full of graphs that looked important. And cannabis, which had endured centuries of confusion, became one of the most publicly analyzed plants in the world. Quite an achievement for something that grows happily in ditches. But we're not here to hurry. Let's slow down and sink deeper into this moment in history because it mirrors something we've seen repeatedly across the centuries. Humans discover something useful. They embrace it. Then they get nervous. Then they ban it. Then they reconsider. Then they embrace it again with the enthusiasm of someone rediscovering a lost hobby. This cycle has happened with spices, tea, coffee, sugar, potatoes, mushrooms, chocolate, and nearly anything else that grows out of the ground. Cannabis simply had the misfortune of becoming politicized during one of humanity's less reasonable centuries. As legalization spread little by little, something interesting happened. The plant started shedding its past narratives, the drama, the propaganda, the stereotypes. People learned how strain differences worked. They learned about THC, CBD, and terpenes. They learned that cannabis wasn't one monolithic experience, but a complex plant that could soothe or energize, quiet or stimulate, depending on how it was used. In a way, the modern world returned cannabis to the position it had held in ancient times. Not a miracle, not a menace, but a versatile plant with many uses. Almost as though history had sighed deeply, stretched its back, and said, "Well, glad we're finally back on track." Still, not everything about modern cannabis is peaceful or simple. Regulation is complicated. Different countries took different approaches, ranging from full legalization to, "Please don't do it, but also, we're not going to stop you," to complete prohibition. And the debates continue, often loudly, though thankfully far from our soft, sleepy atmosphere here. Now let's gently shift our focus from governments and laws to something more human. Throughout all these centuries, from ancient rituals to modern dispensaries, cannabis has been wrapped up in personal stories. Someone using it to calm their mind, someone using it to celebrate a festival, someone using it to ease pain, someone using it to connect with creativity, someone using it because life felt heavy and they needed a moment of lightness. Let's drift into this final stretch together, the last little wandering pathway of our very long, very drowsy historical stroll. If you're somehow still awake after 11 parts of ancient intoxication, medieval boredom, royal confusion, and the general human tendency to make questionable decisions with whatever substances they could get their hands on, then, well, congratulations. You've far surpassed most historical monarchs in stamina and good judgment. Most of them would have tapped out a long time ago, probably around the point where we mentioned the Scythians' hotboxing tents. It just wasn't their style to commit to anything for this long, unless it involved land, taxes, or producing yet another child who would inevitably dislike them. So, as we wander into part 12, let's settle into the softest, calmest ending of this journey. Think of this last section as the gentle cool down, like stretching after a marathon you didn't train for, or like sitting down after walking across a medieval city only to realize you've stepped in something that can't be identified because sanitation still hadn't been invented yet. Yes, that sort of soft landing. And what better way to close our sleepy, meandering history of weed and more than by following the plant into the modern world? The part where things somehow get both more confusing and more boring. Because humans, despite thousands of years of practice, remain astonishingly bad at agreeing on anything, especially when it comes to substances, morality, taxes, medicine, and whether a plant should have legal paperwork. Truly riveting, in the kind of way that makes your eyes grow irresistibly heavy. But let's drift gently. By the 19th century, cannabis had spread across nearly every continent, often carried unintentionally, like that friend who shows up to every event even when no one remembers inviting them. British colony. All officers introduced hemp to places they barely understood. Sailors, merchants, and adventurous botanists kept trading seeds the way people now trade oddly shaped rocks on the internet. And as usual, everyone claimed credit for discovering things they absolutely did not discover. Europe, for example, proudly re-announced cannabis as if unveiling a new invention, even though its own ancestors had been using it for centuries. Victorians did this sort of thing all the time. They'd discover something ancient, rename it in Latin, place it in a dusty cabinet, and then lecture the entire world about it. It was a hobby, a personality trait even. Doctors in the 1800s got deeply invested in cannabis as medicine. They prescribed it for everything from headaches to excessive excitement, which, in Victorian terms, basically meant smiling too long. The era wasn't exactly known for emotional freedom. To them, cannabis was soothing, mysterious, even fashionable, an exotic plant from faraway lands that made people less rigid, which probably terrified the more conservative half of society. So naturally, they did what societies always do when they are frightened by relaxation. They began banning it. Slowly at first, quietly, bit by bit. The same pattern played out in country after country. Someone somewhere would have some kind of moral panic about workers relaxing too much, or teenagers laughing too loudly, or immigrants bringing unfamiliar customs. And then lawmakers, who were rarely experts in anything besides looking stern in portraits, crafted rules that made less and less sense the further you read into them. By the early 20th century, a remarkable thing happened. Cannabis, which humans had used for thousands of years without much fuss, suddenly became the villain of every story. Newspapers printed wild exaggerations. Politicians made dramatic speeches. People who had never seen the plant were convinced it turned individuals into dangerous lunatics, which, historically speaking, was ironic, since many of those politicians had lifestyles far more unhinged than any cannabis user. But irony is one of humanity's greatest talents, so of course it had to show up here too. As the decades drifted onward, research became contradictory. Laws became stricter. Whole generations grew up hearing terrifying cautionary tales without ever being told what the plant actually was. The world went from, "This hemp rope is useful," to, "This herb will destroy civilization," in record time. Meanwhile, other countries quietly continued using cannabis the same way they always had, medically, spiritually, or casually, and wondered why the Western world appeared so troubled by a plant. But confusion is one of humanity's favorite pastimes. Some cultures embraced cannabis for centuries without drama. Others treated it like a mythical beast requiring endless regulation. There was no consistency at all, which, if you've listened to any of the previous parts, should feel comfortingly familiar by now. Let's drift a little closer to the present. By the late 20th century, scientists began studying cannabis seriously again. They found out that, shockingly, centuries of people using it medicinally weren't entirely mistaken. This discovery surprised no one except the handful of officials who had built entire careers around insisting the plant was pure chaos in leaf form. Governments went through incredibly slow cycles of accepting new information. Some changed their laws, some didn't. Some changed them and then, hanged them back because a committee got confused. If you've ever wondered how anything gets done, the answer is slowly and usually after several meetings that could have been emails. Even today, cannabis occupies a strange place in global culture. In some countries, it's a medical treatment. In others, it's legal for fun. In a few, it's still treated like forbidden magic. And everywhere in between, societies are still trying to figure out how to regulate a plant that grows quite happily without permission. It's impressive, really. Humans have invented nuclear power, space travel, and artificial intelligence, yet still can't collectively decide whether cannabis is a healing herb, a harmless pastime, or the reason the youth refuse to mow their lawns. But perhaps that's the perfect ending to our sleepy survey of humanity's relationship with relaxation. People have been using cannabis for thousands of years to treat pain, to meditate, to celebrate, to get through long winters, or simply because it made their extremely stressful historical lives slightly more tolerable. And through all those centuries, one theme has stayed consistent. Humans never stop overcomplicating things. So here we are, at the end of a long, calm drift through time, from ancient shamans and Scythian tents to medieval monks experimenting with questionable herbs, to Victorian doctors and 20th century lawmakers, and finally to the modern world, where the debate continues, softly and endlessly, like a lullaby sung across generations. And maybe that's fitting, because bedtime history has never been about the perfect conclusion. It's about floating gently from one moment to the next, letting the centuries blur a little around the edges, and realizing that in the grand story of humanity, most things make sense only if you squint. By the early 20th century, a remarkable thing happened. Cannabis, which humans had used for thousands of years without much fuss, suddenly became the villain of every story. Newspapers printed wild exaggerations. Politicians made dramatic speeches. People who had never seen the plant were convinced it turned individuals into dangerous lunatics, which, historically speaking, was ironic, since many of those politicians had lifestyles far more unhinged than any cannabis user. But irony is one of humanity's greatest talents, so of course it had to show up here too. As the decades drifted onward, research became contradictory. Laws became stricter. Whole generations grew up hearing terrifying cautionary tales without ever being told what the plant actually was. The world went from, "This hemp rope is useful," to, "This herb will destroy civilization," in record time. Meanwhile, other countries quietly continued using cannabis the same way they always had, medically, spiritually, or casually, and wondered why the Western world appeared so troubled by a plant. But confusion is one of humanity's favorite pastimes. Some cultures embraced cannabis for centuries without drama. Others treated it like a mythical beast requiring endless regulation. There was no consistency at all, which, if you've listened to any of the previous parts, should feel comfortingly familiar by now. Let's drift a little closer to the present. By the late 20th century, scientists began studying cannabis seriously again. They found out that, shockingly, centuries of people using it medicinally weren't entirely mistaken. This discovery surprised no one except the handful of officials who had built entire careers around insisting the plant was pure chaos in leaf form. Governments went through incredibly slow cycles of accepting new information. Some changed their laws, some didn't. Some changed them and then,